It'd be really good if we lived in a world where Christians didn't disagree with each other, but we do live in a world where Christians disagree. I think if we've had any experience at all of being in the church or knowing church history, we'll realise this, it's a reality. Christians don't always think the same way. And it's really hard to know what to do with that. One way of dealing with that is to try and extract ourselves from a really heated situation, if we're in there, and think about another story that we don't have a stake in, that we can look at and examine and draw some lessons from in a kind of objective way that doesn't involve us, and then come back into our current context and think, what did I learn from that? What did I learn from that story that I could use as I negotiate conflict or observe conflict around me? So this story of John Owen and Richard Baxter, I think, is a really interesting one. It's a really sobering one. It's a story that doesn't go well. They don't agree, and they don't do a really good job of not agreeing. They don't come ever to agreement. The relationship just sort of gets worse and worse, and the distance gets more and more. So as I've thought about that story, and I've thought about it a lot, I've thought, what could we learn from that story that would help us in our current day when we can be so polarized, where it's so hard to see and understand the other person? And I think one of the key lessons that I've learnt from that story is that we are very quick to overlook the common ground. When I think about John Owen and Richard Baxter, they had so much in common. It was incredible. If any two men should have been able to get along well and share common aims, it was these two. But somehow they struggled to focus on what held them together, and instead they focused on what drew them apart. And those differences really, in the scheme of things, important, but relatively narrow compared to everything else that they held in common. Not least a common love of God, a dedication to his church, a commitment to the gospel, and lots that they could have formed an affinity over, but they just couldn't do it. And I think that's for me the most important lesson out of their story, really, is that if we find ourselves in a context where we're not agreeing with someone else, instead of minutely examining that and excavating it and making much of it, instead we could just shift our frame of focus and think, what do I have in common? Actually, what do we agree on? Where can we find points of affinity? And we may not resolve those narrow points of disagreement, but at least when we disagree, we do so in a way that's amicable and I think does justice to the burden on us to demonstrate love and kindness and humility and generosity. And it's hard to do that in the context of disagreement, but that's when it counts. And that's probably the main lesson I take from the story.